You may believe you are still falling apart because the life you once recognized no longer fits around you. The ambitions that used to animate you feel strangely hollow. The roles that once gave you certainty now feel like costumes. Even the healing practices that carried you through your darkest years may have begun to feel repetitive, as though you are circling a wound that has already taught you what it came to teach. You may call this confusion. You may call it exhaustion. You may even fear that you have lost the progress you fought so hard to make. But the deeper truth may be more unsettling. You are not returning to the beginning. You are approaching the end of a psychological transformation, and the person who began that transformation cannot accompany you across its final threshold. Carl Jung spent decades studying this movement toward inner wholeness. He understood that the psyche does not become whole by remaining pure, positive, controlled, or spiritually elevated. It becomes whole by bringing its divided parts into relationship. Light and shadow, instinct and conscience, strength and vulnerability, spirit and body, the person you perform and the person you conceal. In the symbolic language of alchemy, the final stage of this transformation was called Rubedo, the reddening. It represented the return of life after purification, dissolution, and inner death. Psychologically, Rubedo describes the stage in which insight must become embodiment. You no longer merely understand yourself. You begin to live from what you have understood. This sounds peaceful when described from a distance. It rarely feels peaceful while it is happening. Rubedo is not a reward handed to you for surviving your darkness. It is the moment your darkness and your light can no longer remain separate. It is the moment when everything you discovered inwardly begins demanding expression through your choices, relationships, work, boundaries, body, and voice. That demand changes you. It may also cost you the identity you built around being wounded, searching, healing, or waiting to become ready. Before Rubedo, much of your inner work takes place in private. You examine your patterns. You confront memories. You recognize projections. You withdraw energy from false attachments. You learn where your personality was shaped by fear, approval, and adaptation. During Rubedo, the question changes. You are no longer asked, "What happened to you?" You are asked, "What will you embody now that you know?" This is why the final stage can feel more confronting than the earlier ones. Pain gives you something to resist. Confusion gives you something to solve. But wholeness gives you responsibility. Once you recognize the truth, continuing to betray it becomes a conscious act. A woman sits at her kitchen table after everyone has gone to bed. Her hand reaches automatically toward her phone, but she stops before touching it. For years, she has filled every silent moment with messages, videos, and other people's emotions. She looks at the dark window instead and realizes that the loneliness she feared is no longer there. What remains is a quiet life waiting for her attention. This is the psychological territory of Rubedo. The ego has already experienced enough dissolution to know that it is not the whole psyche. The shadow has already appeared in enough forms that you can no longer convincingly blame the world for everything you feel. The persona has cracked. The unconscious has spoken. The old identity has lost its absolute authority. Now the scattered pieces must become a living center. Jung called this larger organizing center the self. He did not mean the everyday personality, the social identity, or the image you present to the world. He meant the totality of the psyche, conscious and unconscious together. Individuation is the gradual movement toward relationship with this totality. Rubedo begins when that relationship stops being an idea. You begin to sense that your life is not asking you to become perfect. It is asking you to become undivided. One sign that you have entered the Rubedo stage is that you no longer feel the same need to escape your contradictions. Earlier in your inner work, you may have tried to identify which part of you was real. Were you strong or sensitive, independent or longing for connection, rational or intuitive, kind or angry, spiritual or ambitious? You may have treated these opposites as a problem to solve. One side had to be authentic, and the other had to be conditioning, trauma, ego, or shadow. But wholeness does not require you to choose one half of yourself and exile the other. Jung saw psychological development as a confrontation with opposites. The conscious personality usually builds itself around certain preferred qualities. Whatever contradicts those qualities is pushed away, denied, or projected onto other people. The more strongly you identify as good, peaceful, selfless, disciplined, or rational, the more threatening your anger, desire, selfishness, chaos, and intuition become. Rubedo does not destroy these opposites. It creates a container strong enough to hold them. A man who has always been known as dependable stands in the hallway outside his home office. His partner asks whether he can take on one more responsibility. He feels the familiar word, yes, rising in his throat, but he notices resentment tightening his jaw. He does not explode, accuse, or retreat. He says quietly, "I cannot carry that for you," and remains present while the disappointment enters the room. His kindness has not disappeared. It has become capable of including refusal. This is what integration looks like in ordinary life. It is rarely dramatic. No one applauds when the previously agreeable person stops abandoning himself. No ceremony marks the moment when the strong person admits fear without collapsing into it. No audience witnesses the instant when anger becomes information instead of destruction. Yet these small moments reveal a profound change. You are no longer using one virtue to murder another truth. You can be compassionate without becoming available for exploitation. You can be powerful without pretending you are invulnerable. You can desire recognition without making recognition your god. You can feel envy without turning it into sabotage. You can acknowledge your need for love without calling that need weakness. The contradiction is no longer evidence that you are fraudulent. It is evidence that you are human enough to contain more than one truth. What you once called inconsistency may be the psyche releasing you from the prison of a one-sided identity. This does not mean every impulse deserves expression. Integration is not indulgence. Jung never suggested that consciousness should surrender blindly to instinct. The task is relationship. You learn to hear the rejected part without allowing it to seize the entire personality. Your anger may need a voice, but not a weapon. Your fear may need compassion, but not command. Your ambition may need room, but not worship. Your tenderness may need protection, but not concealment. Rubedo appears when you can remain conscious in the presence of these forces. You stop dividing yourself into the acceptable self and the shameful self. You become capable of choosing without pretending that only one part of you exists. A deeper stability emerges from this. It is not the stability of certainty, it is the stability of inclusion. Another sign of Rubedo is that you feel less compelled to explain yourself to people who are committed to misunderstanding you. This can initially feel like emotional withdrawal. You may worry that you have become colder. You may notice that you no longer rehearse imaginary conversations, in which you finally make someone understand what they did, why you changed, or why your boundaries are reasonable. You may even feel guilty when their misunderstanding no longer disturbs you as deeply as it once did. But explanation often serves a hidden psychological function. It is not always an attempt to communicate. Sometimes it is an attempt to control another person's image of you. The persona depends on recognition. It wants to be seen as good, fair, intelligent, loyal, spiritual, wounded, for a valid reason, or strong under pressure. When another person holds an image that contradicts the persona, the ego experiences this as a threat. You may then offer more evidence, more context, more vulnerability, and more carefully chosen words. You believe you are clarifying the truth, but beneath the clarification may be an old plea. Please preserve the identity I need, reflected back to me. Jung understood that individuation often separates you from collective expectations. The more your inner authority develops, the less completely your identity can depend on social agreement. This does not make you superior to others. It makes you increasingly responsible for living without constant psychological permission. A daughter sits in her parked car after a difficult visit with her family. Her mother has accused her of being distant since she began saying no. She opens a message and types 3 paragraphs, explaining her exhaustion, her therapy, and the years of silent accommodation. Then she deletes everything and writes, "I understand that this is painful for you. My decision remains the same." She places the phone face down. Her hands are trembling, but she does not reach for it again. The shaking matters. Rubedo is not emotional numbness. You still feel the old fear. Your body may still expect punishment, rejection, or abandonment. The difference is that fear is no longer the sole author of your behavior. You stop treating discomfort as proof that your boundary is wrong. You stop turning every accusation into a courtroom. You stop believing that another person's disappointment automatically reveals your failure. This can feel cruel when your identity has been organized around emotional caretaking. If you learn to survive by reading the room, calming conflict, anticipating needs, and becoming whatever preserved connection, then allowing someone to misunderstand you feels dangerous. Yet constantly correcting their perception keeps you bound to their gaze. Your life remains organized around an invisible audience. Rubedo loosens that bond. You begin to understand that being misperceived is sometimes the price of no longer performing. You do not deliberately provoke misunderstanding, and you do not refuse honest conversation, but you recognize when communication has become self-erasure. You can offer truth once, without kneeling before the verdict. What you have been calling detachment may be the psyche withdrawing from the endless labor of managing identities that exist in other people's minds. As this deepens, you may discover that silence feels different. Earlier, silence may have carried humiliation. It meant you had no answer. You had been dismissed. You had failed to defend yourself. Now silence can become containment. You know what is true. You know what you chose. You know which values informed the choice. You no longer need every observer to approve the meaning of your life. This is not arrogance. Arrogance says, "I cannot be wrong." Inner authority says, "I can examine myself without surrendering myself." That difference is central to Rubedo. You become more willing to question yourself, but less willing to abandon yourself merely because someone is unhappy with what you find. Another sign that you have entered Rubedo is that your inner work has begun to move out of your mind and into your body. For a long time, insight may have been your primary form of safety. You learned the language of attachment, trauma, shadow, projection, nervous system regulation, archetypes, and childhood conditioning. You became highly skilled at identifying why you reacted the way you did. This knowledge may have saved you. It gave structure to experiences that once felt chaotic. It helped you stop interpreting every painful response as a personal defect. It gave you enough distance to observe patterns rather than drown in them. But insight has a limit. You can understand why you abandon yourself and continue abandoning yourself with extraordinary self-awareness. You can name the wound while reopening it. You can explain your pattern beautifully and still obey it every time it appears. Rubedo begins when knowledge is no longer enough. The psyche demands incarnation. What you know must enter your posture, breathing, schedule, relationships, speech, appetite, pace, and capacity for rest. The alchemical image of reddening was connected with blood, heat, life, and embodied spirit. The work was no longer about removing impurity from some abstract substance. It was about the emergence of something living. Jung recognized that psychological wholeness could not remain a purely intellectual achievement. An idea about integration is not integration. A theory of the shadow is not a relationship with the shadow. A concept of the self is not obedience to the self. A man sits across from his manager during a performance review. He has prepared a calm speech about being overloaded, but when the moment comes, he hears himself begin to minimize the problem. His shoulders fold inward. He laughs softly and says, "It is probably just me." Then he stops. He places both feet on the floor, breathes, and says, "No, that is not accurate. The workload is not sustainable. Nothing mystical happens." The room remains the same. The manager's expression tightens. The fluorescent lights continue humming overhead. But the man's body has participated in the truth. That is the difference. Embodiment often appears through actions so small that your mind dismisses them. You eat when you are hungry instead of waiting until your body becomes desperate. You leave the gathering when you feel yourself disappearing. You speak before resentment has accumulated enough force to become contempt. You rest without turning rest into a reward for collapse. You notice your breath shorten around a certain person, and you stop calling that reaction irrational before you have listened to it. You feel energy return when discussing a neglected desire, and you allow that energy to matter. You become less fascinated by what your life symbolizes and more attentive to how your life actually feels while you are living it. This is one of the most important movements in individuation. The body becomes a participant in consciousness. Rather than an animal, the ego drags behind it. For years, you may have overridden your body in the name of virtue. You stayed because leaving seemed selfish. You continued because stopping looked weak. You smiled because anger threatened the identity of being loving. You remained productive because exhaustion felt morally suspicious. Rubedo reveals the violence hidden inside this one-sided discipline. Your body was not resisting your transformation. It was recording the cost of your adaptation. The heaviness, tension, numbness, agitation, and fatigue were not always obstacles to overcome. Sometimes they were messages from the life you refused to inhabit. This does not mean every physical symptom has a psychological cause, and it does not replace medical or mental health care. Wholeness includes seeking appropriate support. But the body often carries truths the conscious personality has not permitted itself to know. When Rubedo begins, you stop demanding that the body prove its case in the language of logic. You listen earlier. You respond before the scream. What you have been calling oversensitivity may be the return of a body that no longer agrees to disappear, so your persona can remain convenient. This embodiment also changes your relationship with pleasure. During intense inner work, you may become suspicious of pleasure. Pain feels meaningful. Analysis feels productive. Withdrawal feels deep. You may unconsciously believe that seriousness proves your sincerity. But life does not return to you only through understanding. It returns through warmth, food, movement, creativity, touch, humor, beauty, sexuality expressed with consciousness, and moments that have no therapeutic purpose. Rubedo brings color back. You may suddenly care about the room you live in. You may want to cook slowly, wear something beautiful, dance without documenting it, or create something that does not explain your wounds. These desires can feel shallow after years of psychological descent. They are not shallow. They may be signs that psychic energy is no longer trapped in survival and excavation. You are not betraying your depth when you begin enjoying your life. You are discovering whether your depth can sustain life rather than merely interpret suffering. Another sign of Rubedo is that you stop making an identity out of being the person who is always transforming. This is perhaps the most subtle sign, because the search for healing can become socially admirable. You read, reflect, journal, analyze, withdraw, process, release, and begin again. Each new framework gives language to another layer of yourself. The work is real. The insight is real, the relief is real, but the identity of the seeker can become another refuge from life. As long as you are becoming, you do not have to arrive. As long as you are healing, you can postpone the risk of choosing. As long as there is another wound to understand, another shadow to integrate, or another sign to interpret, you can remain in preparation. Jung's idea of individuation was never a project of endless self-improvement. It was not a demand to refine the personality until nothing difficult remained. It was a movement toward becoming the particular person life was attempting to express through you. That person must eventually act. A woman has spent years imagining the work she wants to create. She has notebooks filled with ideas and folders full of research. Each time she considers sharing something, she decides she needs more clarity. One morning she opens a new document, writes one page, and sends it to someone she trusts before she can redesign her identity around preparing. Her work is imperfect. Her voice is not fully formed. She feels exposed for the rest of the day, but something inside her becomes quieter. The psyche does not always want another insight. Sometimes it wants evidence that you are willing to live. This is where Rubedo differs from the stages that precede it. The earlier stages dissolve false structures. Rubedo builds from what remains. It brings the transformed material back into the world. You may notice that you are less attracted to constant intensity. Dramatic breakthroughs no longer impress you in the same way. You become more interested in consistency, devotion, ordinary responsibility, and whether your choices can survive an unremarkable Tuesday. This can feel like losing your spiritual depth. You are actually losing your addiction to psychological drama. The ego can become attached to crisis, because crisis makes identity feel vivid. There is always an enemy, a revelation, a collapse, a rebirth. Ordinary life feels almost insulting after such intensity. Yet wholeness must be able to wash dishes. It must answer messages, earn money, repair harm, keep promises, and tolerate boredom. It must express itself through how you treat people when there is no symbolic significance attached to the moment. Rubedo does not make every day feel sacred. It allows you to stop requiring sacred feelings before you participate in your own life. You begin to understand that the real test of transformation is not how deeply you can describe yourself. It is whether the people around you encounter a different pattern, whether your body experiences less betrayal, whether your decisions increasingly reflect what you claim to value. This is a humbling stage. You may know exactly why you behave a certain way, and still have to apologize for behaving that way. You may understand that your anger comes from childhood and still remain responsible for where you place it. You may recognize another person's projection and still examine the part of their criticism that is true. You may have undergone profound inner change and still need to learn practical skills you once avoided. The seeker wants transcendence. The integrated person accepts apprenticeship. What you have been calling a loss of intensity may be psychic energy returning from the theater of endless becoming to the unfinished work of being alive. These signs do not arrive in a neat sequence. You may embody one and resist another. You may feel deeply grounded in one relationship and return to an old persona in another. You may experience days of clarity, followed by periods in which the former identity seems to reclaim you completely. Rubedo is not a permanent emotional state. It is a new relationship with regression. You stop interpreting every return of fear, shame, envy, or dependence as proof that the work has failed. The shadow's reappearance no longer invalidates your growth. It gives you another opportunity to relate consciously to what once possessed you. But beneath all these signs is a more uncomfortable truth. You may have entered Rubedo, yet still be waiting for permission to live as the person you have become. You may still hope that transformation will eventually become painless enough to require no sacrifice. It will not. Wholeness costs you the future in which everyone approves of your becoming. It costs you relationships that depended on your silence. It costs you ambitions built solely to compensate for shame. It costs you the identity that made suffering feel exceptional. It costs you the fantasy that one final realization will eliminate uncertainty. Most painfully, it may cost you the right to blame your past for every present choice. Your history matters. What happened to you matters. The adaptations you formed were intelligent attempts to survive conditions you did not choose. Compassion requires that this be acknowledged. But Rubedo brings you to the place where explanation and responsibility must coexist. You did not choose every wound. You do choose whether the wound remains the hidden authority governing your life. This choice is not made once. It appears repeatedly in small, uncelebrated moments. The moment you do not send the message designed to reopen an old attachment. The moment you refuse to shrink a desire because someone might call it unrealistic. The moment you admit that your spiritual patience has become fear. You may have spent years asking what your unconscious is trying to tell you. Now you must face the possibility that you already know. You know which relationship survives through denial. You know which role drains your life. You know where your compassion becomes complicity. You know which dream you keep intellectualizing, because attempting it would expose you to failure. You know where you call yourself confused because clarity would demand grief. Rubedo does not remove the grief. It makes avoidance more difficult to romanticize. This is the shadow beneath the shadow. You may not be afraid of becoming whole. You may be afraid that wholeness will leave you with no excuse for continuing the life that divided you. The familiar life offers belonging, even when it injures you. The integrated life offers truth, but it cannot guarantee companionship. That is the threshold. You are asked to decide whether you will remain loyal to an identity that keeps you recognized, or become loyal to a deeper center that may initially leave you unrecognized. No insight can make this choice for you. No symbol can absorb its cost. No spiritual language can protect you from the human consequences of living differently. There will be disappointment. There may be distance. Some people will accuse you of changing because you have changed. Some will prefer the version of you who required less honesty from them. Others will interpret your boundaries as rejection because your availability once protected them from their own responsibility. You cannot enter wholeness while negotiating endlessly with everyone who benefited from your fragmentation. This does not mean you must sever every bond, abandon your obligations, or treat discomfort as a command to leave. Sometimes integration asks you to stay and become more honest. Sometimes it asks you to repair rather than escape. Sometimes the shadow appears in your urge to declare yourself finished with anyone who challenges you. The self does not always choose the path that flatters your preferred story. You still have to discern. You still have to question your motives. You still have to notice when self-respect becomes defensiveness, when intuition becomes projection, and when independence becomes avoidance of intimacy. Wholeness is not innocence. It is the capacity to remain accountable without returning to self-erasure. You are allowed to stop proving that your transformation is real. You are allowed to stop narrating every internal movement. You are allowed to stop collecting language for experiences your life is already asking you to embody. You are allowed to become less impressive and more consistent. You are allowed to let the old identity die without creating a superior identity from its remains. You do not have to become the awakened one, the healed one, the empath, the outsider, the wise one, or the person who has seen what others cannot see. These identities may once have helped you understand your experience. They become cages when they separate you from the ordinary human condition. You are not being asked to rise above humanity. You are being asked to enter it more completely. Your anger can sit beside your love. Your ambition can sit beside your conscience. Your need can sit beside your strength. Your uncertainty can sit beside your commitment. Nothing has to be expelled for you to move. This is the quiet dignity of Rubedo. The pieces are not finally at peace because conflict has vanished. They are held in relationship by a center deeper than any single mood, role, wound, or desire. You may still feel fear when you speak. You speak without demanding that fear disappear. You may still grieve when you leave what no longer fits. You leave without interpreting grief as a command to return. You may still want others to understand you. You tell the truth without making understanding the price of your integrity. At the beginning, you believed you were falling apart because the old life no longer held you. From the other side, you can see that the breaking was not the opposite of wholeness. It was the opening through which the divided parts of you began returning to one another. Rubedo is not the moment you become flawless. It is the moment you stop postponing life until you are free of contradiction. You become whole when your darkness no longer controls you from exile, and your light no longer needs to pretend it has no shadow. If this resonates, subscribe to The Waking Shadow, where we explore Carl Jung's psychology for those walking the individuation path. Watch the video on your screen now to continue understanding the transformation already taking place within you.